Hello. So I want to talk about the state of data persistence in Magento 2. And I really wish I had more positive things to say about the state of data persistence in Magento 2. But really, that's not fair. I do, but I think I need to talk about the bad things first in order to provide the context. But before we get into that, I'm Matthew. Phil did say that right. It's quite an easy name. I currently consult for Warner Music. I've done a lot of contracting jobs, worked agency side, client side, a bit of a mix of everything, various different integrations, and I've been around a bit. But I started in Magento 1. So my world is sort of influenced by the Magento 1 way of doing things. And when I moved into Magento 2, I carried on trying to do things the way Magento 1 wanted me to do them. I wanted to load and save as the active record facade that Magento 1 provided would let me. It was the way I understood the world. So when I moved into M2, I continued to do that. I was familiar with Magento 1's abstract model, and the abstract model would speak to the resource model, and the resource model would be responsible for speaking to the database abstraction layer, the ZenDB layer, and then we'd save to the database. It all made sense to me. And for a short while, I avoided engaging with the new sort of service contract layers that Magento 2 provides. And eventually I saw the light. I thought this makes a lot more sense. Like in Magento 1, we didn't have something that would define a way to speak to a given module, and now we do. We've got, various different ways, including not just data entity interfaces, but also service repository interfaces and so on. So when I dug a bit deeper, I got quite excited about this. I dug into it and I wanted to sort of evangelize about it, but then I went even deeper. But I think the best way for me to give context on this is through way of example. So let's say that I own a pirate rum store and I sell rum to pirates online. Now, pirates are a bit of a declining demographic, which is a shame. So I need to find more marketing avenues to sell my rum. So I start running adverts in the local paper. Now, pirates don't spend much time online, so they don't typically see these adverts. So I'm thinking, I want to move this into my Magento website. So I need to create an event in Magento, and I need to analyze what things within that event I would want to store in the database. So here I've got an event name, start time, an end time, a location, and a description. It's fairly simple. So how might I go about saving those events? So as I mentioned before, Magento 2 has these new service contracts. And as part of those service contracts, we have data interfaces. So the first thing I want to do is create an event interface. And the second thing I want to do is create an event repository interface. So my event interface will represent what that domain representation of an event is, and my repository will allow me to save it to somewhere. I then need to create a concrete implementation of my event interface, a concrete implementation of my event repository, and then pass the concrete implementation of the event to the repository save method. And that's all fine, and the repositories are great. They allow me to have this new abstraction from the database layer, or any layer. Now I'm going to focus on the database layer, and I'm going to start questioning how I get any further than that. And in Magento 2, that gets quite interesting. So to revisit my problem, I've got an event name, start name, end name, location, and description, and I'm going to want to represent that with an interface that might look something like this. It's quite simple. It's just a bunch of getters and setters. And my repository, the concrete implementation of that will look like that, with more getters and setters that I can't fit on the screen. And my repository interface might look something as simple as this. I've got save, git by ID, and delete. For now, I'm going to focus on save. And if I want to save my model, I'm going to pass it to the save method of the repository. So far, so good. This is what I said before. I got really excited about this. I was like, this makes a lot more sense than what we had in Magento 1. Repositories allow the abstraction between the domain and the implementation detail. They make reusable and they make it more reusable and separate out concerns. We've now got a domain model that I can use in any context, not necessarily just the database. And you could have used interfaces in Magento 1, no one's going to stop you, but now it's part of the culture of Magento 2. And that's quite exciting because more junior devs are looking to aspire towards those sort of design practices. So, as I said, now we need to look at persistent data. Entity interfaces and repository interfaces are great, but we've still got to go that extra step to get it into the database. So Magento 1 used resource models. I think if anyone's worked with M1 or even M2, you'll be familiar with resource models. They look at the columns in a table by using things like show create table and pull that data out and look at what exists. Then one by one, they use those keys to pull the data out of the domain model, one by one, and pass that into the database. So I'm like, okay, that works, it's fine. So I'm like, what's Magento 2 going to do? Well, Magento 2 still uses resource models. It's fine, like I said, it does the job, does what I wanted to achieve. So given such, my repository save method might look something like this. I pass my entity to my repository, and then my repository calls save on the resource model. Now this method accepts an event interface. So when I pass it to the save method, I've instantly got a problem. And why have I got a problem? Because Magento still types on the abstract model on the resource model. So I've now passed the event interface in, but in terms of typing, I could pass it because PHP would probably let me be in PHP. But the reality is I shouldn't, and this resource model expects a different type of object. So looking at my event, it only has an event interface. So how am I going to get around the problem? Well, I want to implement the interface because I like the new Magento service contract way of doing things. But I also want to map to the abstract model because the resource models currently leave me with no choice if I want to save to the database. So I guess the only solution is to effectively do both. So now, if I want to achieve all the nice things I've talked about and save to the database, my model, or data object, which is the event I talked about, has to both implement the data interface, the event interface, and it's got to extend the abstract model. It's got to do both. But at the same time, within the repository, I don't want to assume that the event interface I've been given is an abstract model, because the second I assume that, I'm losing a lot of value. So the only way to go about it from my point of view is to, like I say, implement both, pass that object to the repository, within that repository, map back to the same object, pass it back to the repository, and then pass it to the resource as something that I know is an abstract model. But let's have a look at how that looks in code. So my event now both implements the event interface, extends the abstract model, and then the repository takes the event interface, creates a new event that I know to be something that extends an abstract model, passes all the data one by one, and then calls save on the resource model. It seems a bit verbose, but now it's very reliable. I know what it's doing, and I know that I'm going to have type safety. But this is what I'm talking about when I have a rant about Magento 2's current structure. It leaves me with this problem. It leaves me with this half we've gone to M2, but half we're still in M1 mode. So I dug deeper and I spoke to some people, namely Anton Krill, Vinay Kopp, and I wanted to understand how we got to this place and if we're going to, get rid of this problem eventually, and thankfully we are. So how we're going to remove this problem entirely? Well, Magento in the works have something called the entity manager. Now, this entity manager is currently used in a very, very small place in the back end of the product and category resource models and isn't really currently recommended as the way to go. And that's only because it's very new and Magento haven't gotten around to actually evangelizing it or saying it's ready for production. But it is there. And the entity manager is a Doctrine-esque entity manager. So if you ever use Doctrine, you'll know that Doctrine effectively can rely on reflection to read annotations and map that data using the data types and annotations defined within the event itself. Now, where our event repository before this entity manager looked like this, with the entity manager, where the mappings are going to be done through annotations or something more Doctrine-esque, it's going to look a little bit more like that. It probably will be a little bit more complicated than that. But That's fundamentally the gist of it. But like I said, Magento's Entity Manager is early doors. There's this big comment on the top of it, which I'm not going to make you read now, but it effectively drills down to the fact that it's not ready. And for now, we should stick with the resource model strategy I talked about earlier. And that's me. Any questions?